Welcome back to the Emetophobia-Free podcast. Today we are joined again by the lovely Claire Gildersleeve. Hello, Claire.
Hello. Hi. Nice to see you, Michelle.
You too. Now, Claire wanted to jump back on the podcast today to talk about something that is actually very common and something we both come across when working with clients, and actually something that we both ourselves may have struggled with when we were overcoming emetophobia, and that is, how do you know when you're over it? How do you know when you are no longer emetophobic? And this is quite a big topic, and it has quite a lot of stuff around it to unpack and to discuss. So I'm going to ask Claire to lead us in on this one and talk about why you thought today we would discuss that and what led you to that podcast theme, if you will.
Okay, so I think, as you said, something probably that when we both did it, we would have had to kind of think about that kind of, what does it actually mean? And what does it feel like as well to kind of overcome emetophobia? And I just noticed from a few conversations that I've had with clients, that's always a thing in the discovery calls. I'll kind of say to them, what do you think being over emetophobia means for you? What is that? What does your life, what's it going to look like? What's it going to feel like? What things might you do that you haven't done? And, there's often lots of kind of big things on the list. But they're also kind of, people want to just feel like the day to day is very different. And I think, often as well, there's really excitement when people go into the programme, but there's also can be a bit of trepidation because they've had this phobia for so long, lots of them, or most people really, whether that's a few years, which does feel like a long time when you've had a phobia, or whether it's decades. And I've had people say, I don't actually know who I would be without that phobia anymore. So there can be a bit of trepidation. Also kind of a little bit of comparison where they're perhaps listening to some testimonials, which, as we know, are all genuine and, amazing things that people say. But for sometimes people, those kind of little snapshots of the big things can feel quite daunting. So I wanted to talk about some of the kind of more subtlety, I suppose, of what it means and what, kind of dig into what being over emetophobia is.
Fabulous. Brilliant. Okay. So let's start then by defining a phobia for a start, because that's a good place to start. So a phobia is something that you create yourself in order to protect yourself from having an experience that's too uncomfortable and creating emotions that are too uncomfortable to the point you believe you wouldn't cope. So if I had an experience of that, the emotions I would create would be too much for me. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't cope. And therefore I have to avoid it. So when you get to the point where you think I've got to avoid that thing, there is no option. I absolutely couldn't do it. To save my life, I couldn't do it. Couldn't be sick. Couldn't experience somebody being sick. Then you have to go into sort of overdrive and try your best at all hours of the day to avoid it. So you're plagued by thoughts all of the time, continuously, especially with emetophobia. Because if you have a phobia of flying, for instance, you'd still think about it extremely regularly and it would still be on your mind very regularly, but it wouldn't be arguably as often as emetophobia because you're not going to have to fly that day, whereas you can never guarantee you're never going to be sick that day or witness somebody being sick that day. So it's continually on your mind and it drives your decisions and it drives your behaviours, and you create all sorts of rules for yourself that you follow, that you have to stick to. And the bottom line is you absolutely do not believe you'd cope with it. And that's what creates a phobia. So when we're talking about becoming emetophobia-free, what sometimes happens is people go, okay, well, if I'm emetophobia-free, I've got no beef with being sick. It's absolutely fine. It's not a problem to me. It's really easy. It's as easy as, walking in the park. Or, dead easy. It's not a problem. Yeah, right. But that's not necessarily the case, because what you've done there is you've gone from phobia, massive, intense, over-emotional reaction. A lot of emetophobes will say, I would genuinely rather die than experience this, to not a problem. So if you think about it on a scale, you've got a scale from one extreme, which is phobia, to the other extreme, which is dead easy. Doesn't take any effort, really easy, not a problem. You're right at the end, which is very black and white in the way that you're thinking about it. All or nothing. Okay, I've got everything going. This phobia is in full swing. It's dominating my life. It's completely gone. There's not a shred of me now that doesn't mind being sick. In fact, it's a nothing, right? And what we're trying to get across today, the message that we're trying to get across today is that isn't the case. That you don't have to get to that point to be emetophobia-free.
Yeah.
Would you agree, Claire?
Totally would agree. And I think, there's already been a good podcast, quite a while back about how perfectionism essentially can be the thing that gets in the way with people.
Yeah.
And I do find sometimes that can be that last little hurdle, is that sometimes almost like you said, it's a protection, and that label sometimes can be quite comforting, to people to kind of think, well, I feel amazing. I've had so much change. I can do all of this, but I've still got a bit of emetophobia.
Yeah.
And really, essentially, what they mean is they might still feel a little bit uncomfortable around it, or they might have a strong dislike. But, there's lots of things in life that you can have a strong dislike of, but it's not a phobia.
Right.
And so that is a really key bit of understanding. And I think just because I think that's also why I wanted to talk about this, having had quite a few conversations with clients about that, that's such an important part of understanding, because, once you start to kind of just bring it down a little bit and kind of reduce the stakes almost, and kind of go, oh, maybe it's not a phobia now, maybe it's kind of a bit of an intense dislike. And then it may go down to kind of, it's a dislike, but I don't, I'm not thinking about it very much. And it can kind of diminish that way. You can start to let that drop, because you start to see, as you said, change the kind of unhelpful thinking styles, and you might kind of not feel you need your safety behaviours so much, and then you're just not thinking about it in the same way.
Yes. Yeah.
I
So when we're
totally
talking
agree.
about a dislike, we're talking about things and common dislikes. Getting an injection. Most people would dislike getting an injection, or potentially flying. Most people would dislike flying. You're not in control of that situation. Some people like flying, some people don't. Spiders is another common one. People getting in a lift, going to the dentist, having root canal work. All of these things can be a dislike for people. They don't like them. They would prefer not to do any of those things. But when they roll around, they can handle it, they can manage, they can cope. They might create anxiety and stress. And that's an important point as well. So, I'm sure whoever's listening to this podcast can go, okay, well, yeah, I really don't like getting an injection. I have to really work through that. In my mind, I do create a bit of anticipatory anxiety. My heart does pound. I do kind of get sweaty hands. I do have to look away because I can't look at the needle, and I have to do all of these things to cope with that situation. But that doesn't mean I've got a phobia of it. I just really don't like it. I've got an intense dislike of that. And I have to put energy and effort in to manage it. But that's still not a phobia. So if you liken that to emetophobia, if you believe you can't cope with it, and I believed, for example, I couldn't cope with getting an injection, I wouldn't have an injection. I wouldn't go, right? Absolutely just wouldn't do it. And that's where emetophobes are with being sick, right? I just, anything at all to avoid this thing, I will do that. And that's where you'd be if you had a phobia of needles. I'm just not doing it. Now, you can really hate having an injection. You can hate it. You can, build yourself up to it, create a bit of anticipatory anxiety, create some real-time anxiety. Have to do some deep breathing. Might even have to lie down after it and eat the custard cream or whatever else, right? And you've got to put energy and effort into getting yourself through it. But it's not a phobia. It's a fear, or it's an intense dislike. And get into that understanding of, okay, well, let's think about all the areas of my life where that's the case. Maybe I feel that way on roller coasters. Maybe I feel that way public speaking, or I feel that way. I would feel that way if I was diagnosed with some horrible disorder. If you're not thinking about it day in, day out, if it's not ruling your decisions, if you believe that would be awful, I'd hate it, it'd be horrible, but I'd cope, then it's not a phobia. So the minute you get to, okay, being sick would be horrible, I'd hate it, I'd have to really work through it, I'd have to put effort into this, but I'd cope, then you haven't got emetophobia. And that's really important. I think it's really hard to wrap your head around that when you've had a phobia for so long, and then you're trying to think, well, what does that look like in practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that's, as you were saying, that list of things, you know, spiders, obviously some people keep spiders as pets and love them. As
Yeah.
you said, some people love flying, but
Yeah.
there are kind of like a common list of things that people find
Yes.
uncomfortable. And that's, I think, the big thing as well, is that kind of accepting that it's okay to feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes. I think, you know, it'd be lovely to have a life where you felt absolutely no discomfort, no enjoyment. Although, actually, would it? Because there's no growth that happens from that, is there? There's no
No, there's not.
skills that you develop from that.
No.
And, you know, when people go through tough situations, they would choose not to go through them most
Yes.
often than not. But they will generally say, but I've kind of learned something, or
Yes.
I feel really strong because of that, or, you know, I've taken some silver lining from that, you know. And I think
Yes.
you know, there's that kind of idea of, I had a great conversation with a student at school, because I obviously do this at school, and one of them was saying, I've learned to be more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
That's it.
And I think
Yeah.
that's it, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
so those, I mean, I've just had dental implants because from my emetophobia, when I used to crunch on those mints all day long,
Yes.
I wrecked my teeth.
Oh gosh.
Um, but every time I was in the dentist, I was thinking, I don't love this. This is
No.
uncomfortable, but
Yeah.
actually, it's a great way for me to practice those kind of skills of just
Yeah.
tolerating the discomfort. And I think that's the word I
Yes.
use quite a lot with clients as well. You know, that kind of, you don't have to love it. We're never getting you to a point where you're going, I love being sick,
No.
or I love being
No.
around people being sick.
No.
Don't think there's many people in the world that do. But to get to a point where you can just kind of go, I find that uncomfortable, and I'm kind of okay with that discomfort.
Yeah.
You know, that's where, when people kind of say, how come you can overcome it with no exposure therapy? It's because what actually you're exposing yourself to as you're working through the program is just getting used to a bit of discomfort, and accepting
Yes.
and understanding how that works, and how you can then work with that, and how you can reduce that, and how
Yes.
you can pick yourself up when you feel uncomfortable about something.
Yes.
And I remember when I did the program, my mum, I remember saying, kind of, you know, after that 8 weeks, I've not got emetophobia anymore. And she was like, how do you know that? You're like, very supportively, but she's like, how
Yeah.
do you know? Because, you know, you've not been sick. And for me, the biggest thing was other people being sick. She's like, you've
Yeah.
not been around anyone else. And I was just like, do you know what? I've been telling myself for so long that I've got emetophobia.
Yeah.
I've just got to take that label off now. And I've got
Yes.
to, because, you know, you realise, you know, we talk about the concept of this kind of a belief being like a balloon. And,
Yes.
you know, all those times over the years when I was kind of doing things that kind of were reinforcing my emetophobia, or telling myself or telling everyone else, because I was not a secret emetophobe. I
No.
told everybody that, because I thought, you can protect me.
Yeah.
You know, all those things were kind of blowing air into that balloon, and it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so to kind of just think, actually, I don't have emetophobia anymore. I do believe I'd cope with it. I do believe that even if it would be a bit uncomfortable,
Yeah.
I could kind of get through it. Because
Yes.
actually, looking back, all the evidence is that in the past, when that has happened, I have got through it. You know, I've
Yes.
not kind of
Yes.
crawled up in a ball and never come back out again. You know, and obviously people have it to varying degrees, and there are
Yeah.
some people who, you know, almost do that, you know, where they kind of become agoraphobic, or they,
Yeah.
you know, they can't leave their houses. And so, you know, that discomfort tolerance,
Yes.
and you know, what emetophobia is and where that line is different for individuals, isn't it? So that's
Yes.
as well something for people to kind of think of as they're going through this, and thinking about, actually, where is my line? You
Yeah.
know, where is that point for me where it's no longer about emetophobia, but
Yeah.
it's
Definitely.
just something I find difficult.
Yes. So the label that you've mentioned a couple of times there is so important, because emetophobes have this black and white thinking
Mm,
style, quite dominant in their thinking. And it's not just to do with emetophobia, they tend to think in a black and white way across the board.
yeah.
Now, when you have emetophobia and you label yourself as emetophobic, if you look at it on a spectrum, again, of that scale that I was talking
Mm,
about before, if you've got emetophobia at this end and over emetophobia at this end, there's a whole range of grey in the middle. And what we don't need to do is jump from one to the other. Okay, so you can remove the label and say, I'm over emetophobia, if you feel that that's the case for you. However, that wasn't personally my experience. I had to remove the label from I've got emetophobia to I'm working really hard to get over my emetophobia. I'm on the way to overcoming my emetophobia. My emetophobia isn't as bad as it used to be. And I had to sort of go through that grayscale in order to for me then one day to go, do you know what? I don't have this anymore.
Yeah.
You know, and you don't need to expect yourself to go from one to the other, but
Yeah.
you do have to shift the very concrete black and white label of I have emetophobia, because there's no wiggle room in that.
Yeah.
So obviously, what we're not saying here is just tell yourself you don't have emetophobia and then
Yeah.
it's gone.
Yeah.
That's not what we're saying.
No.
Because you have to understand all of what's going on for you psychologically, all the psychological components that make up emetophobia.
Yeah.
You've got to put the work in. You've got to, increase your sense of power and control, increase your self-esteem. You've got to work through the program.
Yeah.
But then once you've done all that work and you start seeing evidence that you are making progress and you start seeing yourself doing things going, oh, I wouldn't have done that before. And actually, I created a lot less anxiety this time than I did last time. When you start seeing that evidence, you've got to make a record of it and you've got to note it down, really process it, and take that as permission, if you will, to remove that label. Even if you just move it to, I'm working hard to get over it.
Yeah.
I'm on the way to overcoming it. I'm nearly there with overcoming emetophobia.
Yeah.
There's got to be that shift away from that very rigid, static label of I have emetophobia.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you cling to that, sorry, go on.
Yeah. No. That thing of like recognizing your progress is so important, and that's where, as I said, sometimes people can compare themselves to somebody else's testimonial, where actually what they need to be doing is comparing their old self to their new self, or kind of how they've been previously, as you said, in kind of a similar situation. If they've managed it a little bit better this time, that's real progress. And that's progress, not perfection. Obviously we talk about kind of quite a bit, and that is really, really key, because that is the thing that as we've spoken about, and as the other podcast spoke about, can hold people back. I had a discovery call with a lovely lady last week, just to kind of talk through a few things. She'd sent me an email and said, I've gone through the book, I've worked with a coach previously. She said, I've got to myself, and it was an amazing email. I was reading it kind of going, you don't sound like you have emetophobia. Because it was literally, she was like, I do this differently now. She said, I can clean the sick up if my kids have been sick. I can clean, empty the sick bowl. And she was just like, but I still feel a little bit, kind of, my heart goes a little bit when it's happening. And I was like, that's okay. Maybe. So that was the conversation we had, was actually, just kind of accepting that feeling a bit of discomfort isn't a bad thing, isn't the end of the world. And actually, to then be able to go, well, actually, I've done all this stuff that I couldn't do before, even if it's been a bit difficult. That's real kind of strength on her part and real progress on her part. But she just couldn't quite see it, because she kind of felt any anxiety, any, kind of little kind of worry, any, kind of thoughts that might be kind of habitual thoughts from what she'd had before, was that it's still emetophobia. So that was what we were really working on, was kind of that perspective there, really.
Absolutely. What she's saying there ultimately is, I can cope. I can cope when my kids are sick. I can cope when I'm sick. I just don't like it. And that leads us, right back to the start of this conversation, that's not emetophobia, because you can cope, and you proved to yourself you can cope. But even if you've not proved it in that moment, if you believe you can cope with it, that's arguably more important than your actual coping skills in that situation. And let me just explain what I mean by that. So if you believe that you can cope with, let's put it in the context of the dentist again, I can cope with going to the dentist, have an injection in my gums, having my root canal, or whatever else I'm having done. I really won't like it, but I can cope. You're going to put energy and effort into coping because you believe you can. So you're going to do things like count the ceiling tiles and take some deep breaths and distract yourself and, tell the dentist to keep talking to you. And you're going to put energy and effort into coping with the situation because you believe you can. When you believe you can't cope with that situation, you're not going to put that same effort in. Because you're going to go, well, what's the point in going? I know I can't cope, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to. I'm just going to panic. I'm just going to create panic, get myself in a tears, get myself in a whirl, and have to leave. So your belief as to whether you could cope or couldn't cope with something is massive, and it's hugely important. So you can create a belief that you can cope with something without exposing yourself to that thing. You can do that because if you look at the statistics as to how many emetophobes haven't actually been sick or don't remember being sick at all, but they've built this belief, that they can't cope with it, even though they've never experienced it. And they've done that because of all the unhelpful thinking styles, because they've imagined not coping, because of the belief systems that they've built, because of the way that they think in this black and white catastrophic way. They've built this for themselves. And having that understanding of those mental cognitive components, if you will, and knowing how they work, you can equally build a belief yourself that you can cope without having to expose yourself to it. It works both ways.
Yeah.
Which is why exposure therapy isn't part of this program. It's not necessary to be. So it's very much allowing yourself to take that label down a notch and go, do you know what? I really wouldn't like it. In fact, I might even hate it, but I cope. If you believe you'd cope, then at that point, you don't have emetophobia anymore. You might still want to keep working on it. You might still want to bring it down from a massive fear to a really intense dislike. That's fine. But shift the label.
Yeah.
Because that's really important, and that will help you to get from an intense dislike to I really don't like it, but I cope. It will help you shift it when you shift that label.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people think, when you said about kind of putting effort in, like people sometimes I think as well can think, oh God, it feels like so much hard work to be kind of thinking of it all the time and thinking about. But actually, I would say it's harder work to live with emetophobia because, what we're not doing as well is kind of saying, oh, it's okay. You can just kind of, emetophobia doesn't really exist. It does exist, of course. We wouldn't be here if it didn't exist.
No, yeah.
But that label sometimes is, kind of, we can let it go a little bit.
Yes.
But what happens, as you said, sometimes rather than putting the effort into the coping skills, is there's loads of effort putting into all the avoidance and putting into the kind of overthinking and worrying about how can I escape this, how can I get out of that, how can I change that, how can I kind of live my life, and this is one of the most common things that people kind of say when I say what will it mean to you to overcome it, is I just want to live my life without that being the biggest deciding factor in everything that I do.
Yes.
And I think unless you've had emetophobia, or perhaps you've been very close to someone with emetophobia, I don't think often people realise quite how much it's in your mind the whole time.
Yes.
And, I think that's one of the biggest kind of things where, and in fact, just before this, I kind of got in touch with a few clients, and just kind of recent clients said, just kind of wondered what is it to you? What is overcoming the emetophobia? And, I've got some lovely kind of little kind of quotes from them, but some of the, kind of real common themes were just not in my head anymore. Like my mind is freed up so much more. I'm not kind of creating that kind of worry about it all the time. And there was a couple of them who said, sorry, I'm going to look at a bit of paper here.
Go for it.
There was a great kind of one here from my client Megan, who she, when we were working through the program, there was an episode where her daughter was sick, and she was like, oh, I dealt with it. But again, she was a little bit kind of reluctant, I think, to let go of that label. And then obviously a few months has passed now. In fact, I think I was working with her kind of last summer. So but she's basically kind of, I said, oh, how's it going? And she said, oh, I meant to message you. She said, my mum had to go into A&E. She said, I had to sit there. She said, I was surrounded by people holding sick bowls, and I kind of didn't panic. And she said, and then she's had to stay in, and there's been 3 different people being sick in the bay around her. She said, never once did I want to kind of flee. But she said it made me realise that for me, being fixed isn't about never having a worried thought about if I'm going to be sick, or having a moment of dread if the kids say they feel sick. The important part is that's as far as it gets, just a moment of
Yes.
worry or dread,
Yeah.
always followed by a genuine belief that everything is actually okay because I can cope no matter what life throws at me.
Brilliant.
And so she's developed those skills from looking at not just being sick, but lots of other aspects in her life as
Yes.
well. You know, she
Yes.
started studying a new course of, you know, after we finished working together. And, you know, I think that's another thing that comes through is that being over emetophobia doesn't just impact how much you think about being sick. You know, it's
Yes.
kind of, it can really kind of, you feel that benefit in your whole life, really. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
I had a similar conversation with a client who I finished with recently, and she said we all had the sickness bug. So she got 2 boys and a husband,
Mm,
and the husband started first, and then the boys, and then she got it. And she said, I did it. I coped. It
yeah.
was fine. I didn't like it. It really
Mm,
wasn't very nice. And I was sweaty, and it really felt uncomfortable, and I didn't like it at all. But I coped, and I did it, and I did it really well.
yeah.
But where she was getting stuck was she said, but even though I know I'd cope, I still have the thought. I still have the thought, I
Mm,
hope they don't get the sickness bug today. You know, so her boys are going to school. She knows. She's got concrete evidence that the boys coped, her husband coped, she coped, everybody was
mm,
fine. They moved on, it was fine. She still creates the thought, oh no, what if they bring a sickness bug home today?
mm,
And it was getting her to understand that a thought, an unhelpful thought, is just that. It's just an
yeah.
unhelpful thought, right? You don't need to buy into that. You don't need to believe that thought. You don't
Mm,
need to give it any airtime. You just sort of, let's
yeah.
label it. It's just an unhelpful thought.
Mm,
That doesn't mean you've still got a emetophobia, because what you're
yeah.
saying to me is, I know I cope. It'd be fine if they did.
Mm,
I just hope they didn't. That's
yeah.
okay. That's like saying, oh, I've got a bit of a toothache. I hope I don't have to go to the dentist today. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you've got
Yeah.
a phobia of the dentist. You just
Yeah.
dislike it if it happens.
Yeah.
So it's not winding yourself up about having these unhelpful thoughts, because they're just
Mm,
unhelpful thoughts.
yeah.
Most people have unhelpful thoughts about being sick. Most
Yes.
people,
Yeah.
emetophobes or not. You know,
Yeah.
they would say, my husband, for example, when my daughter got a sickness bug just before, or just in December this year, he said out loud, "Oh, hope we don't get it." Right,
Yeah.
but he's never been emetophobic, and he
Yeah.
doesn't particularly bother about being sick, but he still doesn't want to have
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So having an unhelpful thought doesn't mean you've still got emetophobia. Just
Yeah.
means you're having an unhelpful thought.
Yeah.
The skills you learn in the program means I know what to do with that unhelpful thought.
Mm,
I
yeah.
can, I can respond to it powerfully.
Yeah.
I can ignore it almost and sort of go, well, that's an unhelpful
Yeah.
thought. Well done me. Let's move on.
Yeah.
I don't need to buy into it. I don't need to then brood about it and catastrophize about it and get hypervigilant around it.
Mm,
And I think this is a key part as well when we're talking about letting go of that label, because this lady I was talking to clearly didn't have emetophobia anymore, but
yeah.
believed she did. She still had the
Mm,
label. Because she hadn't removed that label for herself, because she hadn't gone, do you know what, I haven't got emetophobia, I just really don't like being sick.
yeah.
She hadn't given herself permission to relax.
Yeah. Yeah.
She hadn't given herself permission to stop the brooding and to stop the hypervigilance and to stop the catastrophizing, because she still believed she had it. So
Yeah.
she was like, well, if I've still got it, and it is still this
Mm,
terrible thing and terrifying thing, then I've got to stay on edge and I've got to stay on my guard and I've got to keep looking out for danger and I've got to keep
mm,
thinking about it because I've still got emetophobia. And when we unpicked it, I was like, well, you don't have emetophobia anymore. You just really don't like being sick.
yeah.
If it's something that you really don't like but you can cope with, you can afford to relax and afford
Mm,
yourself to go, do you know what, I don't need to brood about this right now.
yeah.
That's just a catastrophic thought. Well
Mm,
done me. I've spotted it. I can move past it. I can reframe that. I can challenge that thought, etc. So it's almost giving yourself permission
yeah.
to relax and to calm that thinking down
Mm,
when you spot yourself going into brooding mode or catastrophizing mode or being hypervigilant. If you've removed that label, then you're allowing yourself to work on those little bits that will inevitably then have a knock-on impact as to how powerful you feel, and therefore have a knock-on impact into how many of your safety-seeking and avoidance behaviours you feel you're
yeah.
able to drop and tackle. Letting yourself relax into that notion, if you will, that I'm overcoming it or I'm over this thing, will allow you to create the experience of being emetophobia-free that you want, rather than keeping on believing that you've got it when actually you were over it a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, just to add to that as well, I think the other thing is people kind of can think, well, okay, I'm okay in my thoughts, but I might have a bit of a reaction. Now, I had, you know, 'cause as I said, I was more worried about anyone else being sick. And I live in London and I spend 3 hours every day when I'm working in school, commuting from one side of London to the other. And
Yeah.
that was always my worry, was that I would see somebody that was being sick,
Yeah.
basically. And in all that time, in, you know, kind of 20 odd years of living in London, I hadn't seen it until probably about 8 weeks ago.
Right.
And I walked past, I was just kind of walking, going to get on my train, and I walked probably within about kind of 10 feet of a lady that was being sick into a bag.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had a momentary little, oh, like my heart
Mm.
just kind of went like a little, oh,
Yeah.
and then I walked on and it was fine. Now,
Yeah.
had I had that real black and white thinking, I could have thought, oh, I had a reaction
Yeah.
there. Does that
Still
mean my
emetophobia.
phobia is still there? Does that mean, but I know actually that actually I was going, oh, do you know what? I didn't steer away. I just carried on
Yeah.
walking.
Yes.
I had a almost probably a slightly involuntary reaction, you know, because
Yes.
that's the thing as well, isn't it? The first reaction sometimes happens, and sometimes
Yes.
that might be
Yes.
out of habit. You know, I had
Yes.
years
Yes.
where I wouldn't even watch that on the TV, and my heart would really be doing that if I
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
you know, or kind of if I thought it was going to happen, my heart would be, ugh.
Yeah.
But I was like, do you know what? I've got this is the choice, isn't it? Of being able to either kind of go, ooh, could I put lots of thought now into, could that be emetophobia coming back? Is that, you know, a sign that I'm not totally over it? Ooh, that didn't feel very nice. I mean, it literally was kind of like a
Yes.
second. So,
Yes.
but I was like, what I really, and this is what I would advise to any of my clients. So sometimes you kind of advise yourself as well, is
Yes.
kind of go, do you know what? I've not been worried about this for 5 years,
Yep.
and I've
Yep.
seen it. I've had a momentary little, oh, that's a little bit unexpected. It's kind of a bit like, I suppose, if I was walking past someone and they jumped out from behind a pillar, or not even
Absolutely.
as extreme as
Yes.
that, but you know, where
Or
it was just a
shouted
bit
really
of a
loudly at
surprise.
you. Yes.
Exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
it was just a bit of a surprise,
Yep.
and my focus then was kind of going, oh, do you know what? I'm not getting on the train and thinking, oh, she just got off this train. Am I going to walk past something? What's she touched?
Yeah.
What's happened? You know, it wasn't then something as well that I was then becoming on the lookout for,
Yes.
because my initial response perhaps was a little bit more kind of just like instinctive, but
Yep.
the second reaction response, or the reaction, or sorry, my initial reaction, the response, how I
Yes.
responded to that, that's
Yes.
much more within my power.
Yes.
And you know,
Yes.
to kind of go, actually, again, that's okay to have a little bit
Yes.
of a woo, like I
It is.
would, as you said, if someone shouted something and I
Yes.
got a bit startled.
Yes.
That's all that is.
Yes.
But that goes to show how much it's important not to kind of keep that label when it's not necessary, and it's not
Absolutely.
undermining how awful it is to live with emetophobia, and you know how kind of a bigger thing it is, and how many people have it. There are so many people that have it, but that's a really key bit of perspective, just
It
to kind
is.
of go, actually. And you know, when I went into work and I was like, oh, I saw someone being sick, they all went, ooh, you know,
Yes.
they almost all
Yes.
had that reaction, even
Yes.
though they weren't there,
No. And they're
because
not
it's not pleasant.
emetophobic.
Exactly, because it's not pleasant, and
Yes.
that is the kind of, as we were saying, you're not getting to the point where you're going, oh, I love that.
No.
Actually, in some ways, I could look back now and go, oh, I'm glad I had that experience, because it's proven to me that
Yes.
it's all
Yes.
fine.
Yes.
um, and it's not going to kind of come and get me. I think when I had the phobia, I really, you kind of, your imagination. I think an emetophobics generally will have really strong imaginations. It's almost like I was imagining if someone was going to be sick on the train, it would like come and get me. It would like morph into
Yes.
some sort of like
Yes.
big wave,
Yes. Yes.
but it's not as big either as you think it is. So
No. No.
that was a really good kind of point.
Definitely. I have a similar one, whereas because mine wasn't really other people being sick unless it was contagious.
Yeah,
It was me being sick. Now I'm about 7.5 months pregnant at the moment, and I've been through the morning sickness period, and during that period, excuse me, I was going for my 12-week scan, and it was the morning of the 12-week scan. I woke up and I thought, oh crikey, I feel really, really nauseous today, and
yeah,
I'd been feeling nauseous for a few weeks. But it had ramped up a level. I thought, okay, well, I really want to go for this scan, right? So we're going to go for it. But I took a bag with me. So I was like, well, it may happen. And my
yeah,
husband drove. And whether it was the movement of the car, whatever it was, I got out the car at the hospital and had to sit down in the car park with this bag because I was like, I'm going to be sick any moment here. Now, I wasn't, right, in that moment, but I was sat in a public place with a Tesco carrier bag, right? So my husband was going, "You all right?" I was going, "Yeah." My mouth was watering. It was almost, I was on the verge of being. Now, that was not a pleasant experience. I wasn't sitting there going, "This is great. This is not a problem. Don't mind this at all. Absolutely fine." Right? I was going, "I really don't like this. This is really uncomfortable."
Yeah.
You know, because I was on the floor in a car park for a start and feeling like I was going to be sick. But acknowledging that I had some unhelpful thoughts about it and I didn't enjoy it. And, it did come in waves as I was having my scan and everything else, and they're pressing on your stomach, and wasn't a pleasant experience. That didn't mean I've still got emetophobia. I just don't like being sick, right? And that's fine, because I was able to move on very, very quickly afterwards and sort of go, okay, well, that's passed. Well, that wasn't very nice, but similar to you, I can look back at that and go, I can do it, right?
Yeah.
And it adds weight to that belief that I'd cope and I'd be fine. I wouldn't like it, and it's still not my favourite thing, and I'd still rather not feel that way. As most people would rather not be sat in a car park with a Tesco carrier bag. But when that does occur and you show yourself that you can cope and you don't buy into those unhelpful thoughts, and that's the key. Having the initial reaction as you did, or having the unhelpful thoughts like I did, you're kind of not responsible for those. They're fine. They're just unhelpful thoughts. It's what you do with them that counts. It's how you label it. It's how you respond to it. It's the narrative you tell yourself about it. It's that understanding that if I do buy into this and blow it up and keep putting air into this balloon and catastrophize it, then I am going to start creating more anxiety and more stress. But I know that that's not helpful, and I know that I can respond to this more powerfully. So therefore you do. But as you know, the whole point of this podcast is you and I still both had that we've got emetophobia label, our responses will have been very different, because we would still be operating almost as if we had emetophobia. So we would still be telling ourselves we had emetophobia and responding to those things as if we had emetophobia. So it's very, very important that the minute you realise that you cope with it, the very second you go, I'd hate that, but I'd get through it, I'd be all right, you don't have emetophobia anymore. And it's really getting to grips with that idea. And then once you've shifted that label, allowing yourself to go, do you know what? I don't have emetophobia. I'd cope with it. It's not a threat. It's not something that's coming to ruin my life. It's not a life or death situation. It's not beyond all realms of possibility. I can allow myself to relax, and it speeds up your progress. It speeds up that journey towards London, from Cambridge to London we talk about, but that journey towards the life that you want to be living, which is one that's not dominated and plagued by these thoughts all day long.
Because coping doesn't mean coping perfectly, does it? That's it.
Nope.
Coping with some effort, coping with even a little bit of a struggle. If you think, there are so many. If you think about, the big serious, horrible things that people have happen in life, and they lose someone, or no one is going, but you've got to not feel anything, and you've got to not have any discomfort, or you can't feel sad, and you can't feel angry, and you can't. We have feelings. We're human beings. We're not robots. And we're not trying to create a whole nation of thriving robots. We're trying to create a nation of humans who have feelings and know how to manage them, know how to deal with them.
That's it. Yes, perfect. Fantastic. Well, have you got anything else to say on the matter? Do you think we've covered all bases there?
No. I've got lots of lovely comments, as I said, from clients, but I'm going to just put them on my private Instagram soon, and so I'll share them that way, because there's some amazing stuff that people have. But the thing that I think really kind of came through is, as well, just the day-to-day. That is what being over emetophobia is. It's not necessarily having to kind of scale a mountain and bungee jump and feel feel that you can do all these amazing things that you've never kind of think to do before. It's sometimes just, as one of my clients, Anne, said, life just feels lighter. And that's the really nice thing. So
that's it. Perfect.
Leave it on that.